The words hit Theodora Brooks like a slap across the face, sharp and clean and entirely unexpected. "Ask me again when you are ready," Micah Graves said quietly, his voice low as river stone, his dark eyes cutting sideways to look at her before he turned them back toward the fire. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He simply pulled his battered hat from his knee, set it on his head, and walked away into the darkness of the New Mexico night, leaving her standing there with her heart caught somewhere between her throat and the dirt beneath her boots. She had asked him if he loved her. She had stood there with every nerve in her body alight, with 3 months of silent tension and careful glances and accidental touches poured into 6 desperate words, and that was what he had given her. Not yes, not no, not even the dignity of a flat refusal. Just that quiet, measured, devastating sentence delivered like a man who already knew the answer but refused to say it until she had earned the right to hear it. Theodora stood motionless while the fire crackled behind her and the coyotes called somewhere far off in the Black Hills. The stars above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were enormous and indifferent. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs to stop it. She was not a woman who begged. She had survived too much to beg. She had buried a husband, crossed 4 states alone, and rebuilt herself from the scorched foundation up. She did not beg, but she stood there by the dying fire and she made herself a quiet promise. She would ask him again before morning came. To understand what had brought Theodora Brooks to that fire, to that moment of terrifying vulnerability in the dark high desert of New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to a cold March morning in Abilene, Kansas, and a telegram she should never have opened. She had been 26 years old and recently widowed when she received the letter from her husband's business partner, a man named Gerald Cott, informing her that the mercantile shop she believed she owned outright was, in fact, mortgaged 3 times over. Her husband, Thomas Brooks, had been a charming man with elegant hands and a talent for creative accounting. He had borrowed against every asset they owned, including the building she had inherited from her father, and had done it all without telling her. When a horse threw him in November of 1877, and he died 3 days later of a broken skull, he left Theodora with a business she did not legally own and debts she could not pay. Gerald Cott had been sympathetic in the particular way that men are sympathetic when they want something. He had offered to purchase the remaining equity of the shop, settle the debts, and leave her with enough cash to start over somewhere. He had made this offer 3 times, each time in a slightly smaller office with slightly more people present, until Theodora understood that the offer was not really an offer. It was a trap with a polite name. She had taken the money. She had packed 2 trunks, her mother's silver hairbrush, a Remington rolling block rifle she had taught herself to fire during a brief and terrifying encounter with cattle raiders in 1875, and she had purchased a ticket south on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. A woman she had met at a church social in Abilene had told her about a town called Cimarron, New Mexico territory, where a decent woman with business sense could build something real. The woman had made it sound clean and simple. Nothing about it was clean or simple. Theodora arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, exhausted and dusty, and carrying every remaining cent she had in the world inside a leather purse she kept pressed against her ribs under her traveling coat. The town was small, but not as small as she had feared. There was a proper hotel, a land office, several saloons, a hardware store, a post office, and a freight company that operated out of a large barn at the south end of the main street. There was also, as she quickly discovered, a great deal of unspoken tension that ran through the town like a fault line. Cimarron in 1878 was caught in the long shadow of the Colfax County War, the land dispute that had been simmering and occasionally erupting into open violence for years, fueled by the competing claims of the Maxwell Land Grant Company and the settlers who had built homes and worked land they believed they had a right to keep. Federal officials were involved. Hired guns were involved. Corrupt sheriffs had been involved before they were replaced by slightly less corrupt ones. The ordinary people of Cimarron existed inside this ongoing conflict, like people who have learned to walk carefully through a room where the floor is not entirely trustworthy. Theodora noticed this within her first 2 days. She noticed it in the way people lowered their voices when certain names came up. She noticed it in the way the land office clerk seemed nervous when she asked about purchasing a small plot at the edge of town. She noticed it most clearly when a man named Harlan Dukes, who ran the largest freight operation in the county, came into the hotel dining room on her 3rd morning and sat down across from her without being invited. Harlan Dukes was perhaps 50, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from having owned things for a long time. He wore good clothes and a gold watch chain, and he smiled the same way Gerald Cott had smiled, with his eyes somewhere else. He told her he had heard she was looking to establish herself in Cimarron. He told her there were opportunities for a smart woman in the freight business, specifically in the bookkeeping side of things. He told her a lot of things in a short amount of time, and underneath all of it, Theodora heard the real message clearly enough. He wanted to know what she had and whether he could use it. She thanked him politely for the conversation and told him she was not yet certain of her plans. She finished her coffee after he left and sat for a long moment staring at the surface of the table, breathing carefully. That afternoon, she went to the freight barn at the south end of the street to inquire about hiring someone to help her transport her trunks to a boarding house she had located 2 streets over. The barn was large and smelled of horses and hay and axle grease. A man was repairing a wagon wheel in the shade near the open doors, and he did not look up immediately when she walked in. He was perhaps 30, lean but broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore plain work clothes, worn but clean, and his hands on the wagon wheel were careful and precise. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the particular dark brown of creek water in deep shade, and they assessed her with a directness that was neither rude nor particularly warm. It was the look of a man who had learned to measure things accurately. "Looking for someone to haul goods?" he asked. His voice was low and even. "2 trunks," she said. "From the hotel to the Mercer boarding house." He nodded, set down his tools, and stood. He was taller than she had expected, perhaps 6 feet, and he moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had spent years working with his hands and his body and had learned not to waste either. "Rate is 25 cents for a local haul," he said. "I can have them moved within the hour." "That suits me," she said. He picked up a worn leather jacket from a nail on the wall, and she noticed then that he moved slightly differently on one side, a careful favoring of the left that was practiced enough to be almost invisible. She did not mention it. He had not mentioned it. His name, she learned during the short walk back to the hotel, was Micah Graves. He ran the freight operation not for Harlan Dukes, as she had assumed, but independently, operating out of a section of the barn he rented from its owner, a retired miner named Hobbs who lived in Taos and only cared about the monthly payment arriving on time. He had been in Cimarron for 2 years, he told her, coming down from Colorado after working cattle and mining, and a brief stint driving supply wagons for the Army. He said all of this without particular emotion, in the straightforward way of a man answering a direct question, and Theodora found it startling and pleasant after days of being talked at by people with obvious agendas. At the hotel, he lifted both trunks without any particular drama, despite the fact that they were heavy and the walk to the boarding house was the better part of a quarter mile. He did not try to make conversation. He delivered the trunks to her room, collected his 25 cents, and prepared to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Graves," she said at the door. "Ma'am," he said, and that was all, and he walked back down the stairs. She stood in the doorway watching him go and felt, for the first time since she had received Gerald Cott's letter in Abilene, something that was not dread or exhaustion or grinding practical calculation. It was faint, and she could not have named it precisely. But it was there. Over the following weeks, Theodora began the careful work of establishing herself. She had enough cash remaining from the sale of the Abilene shop to last perhaps 4 months if she was frugal, and she intended to be more than frugal. She spoke with the land office clerk, a nervous young man named Phelps, and began to understand the complicated web of competing claims that made property ownership in Cimarron a risky proposition. She spoke with several of the town's women, who were more forthcoming than the men once they understood she was not a threat to anything they valued. She learned from a widow named Clara Hensley that the Maxwell Land Grant Company's agents were actively working to push smaller landowners and settlers off claims, and that Harlan Dukes was known to have an arrangement with certain company men that benefited him greatly. She learned that Micah Graves was generally liked and trusted, but that he kept himself at a careful distance from the town's politics, which some people found admirable and others found suspicious. She also learned from Clara that Micah Graves had come to Cimarron from Colorado under circumstances that Clara described only as difficult, which in Clara's careful vocabulary meant something significant. Theodora thought about this. She encountered Micah regularly in those first weeks, as one inevitably did in a town of Cimarron's size. He was always civil, always direct, never effusive. He helped her once when a delivery she had arranged for some household goods arrived short, and the merchant tried to pass off the shortage as her error in ordering. Micah had been there at the freight barn when it happened, and he had quietly produced the original invoice she had filed with him, and the shortage became the merchant's problem and not hers. She had thanked him afterward, standing in the sunlight outside the barn. "You filed a copy," she said. "I didn't know you kept copies." "I keep copies of everything," he said. There was something in the way he said it that suggested he had learned to do so the hard way. In April, she found the property she wanted. It was a small building on a side street, previously used as a dry goods store, which had been sitting empty for 6 months. The owner, an elderly man named Vasquez who had moved to Santa Fe to live with his daughter, was willing to sell for a price Theodora could manage if she was careful. She spent 3 days going over the figures before she committed, sitting at the small desk in her boarding house room with a lamp burning late into the night, running columns of numbers until they made sense. She went to Micah Graves to help her transport equipment and fixtures she was bringing in from Albuquerque. It was a legitimate business reason to seek him out, and she told herself that was the only reason she chose him over the other 2 freight operators in town. "What kind of business?" he asked. "Millinery and dry goods," she said. "There is no decent millinery in Cimarron. The women here are spending significant money ordering from catalogs that take weeks to arrive. I intend to carry basic dry goods for income stability and expand the hat and fabric inventory as business grows." He had looked at her steadily for a moment. "You have the capital for that." It was the kind of direct, potentially impolite question that most people would not have asked. She respected him for it. "Barely," she said honestly, "but the margins on millinery goods are better than anything else I can find, and I'm a better bookkeeper than anyone would guess by looking at me." Something shifted in his face then, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that a smile was a thing his face knew how to do. "When do you need the goods?" he said. He made 2 runs to Albuquerque for her over the course of April and early May, hauling in the equipment and inventory she needed to outfit the shop. Each time he returned with exactly what she had ordered, carefully wrapped and undamaged, with an itemized list of everything in the wagon and the total weight. He charged her a fair rate, the same rate he would have charged anyone, and she paid him immediately each time without negotiating, because she had decided that Micah Graves was someone she wanted to keep being honest with. The shop opened on the 12th of May, 1878. Theodora named it simply Brooks Goods and Millinery because she was too busy to be clever about it, and because she wanted people to know whose name was attached to it. Clara Hensley came to the opening and brought 4 other women with her, and 3 of them bought things. And by the end of the first day, Theodora had taken in more money than she had spent in a week at the boarding house. She stood alone in the shop after closing, doing the evening's accounts, and allowed herself precisely 1 minute of something that might have been joy before she set it aside and went back to the numbers. Micah came by on the second day to check that the fixtures had survived the installation without damage. He looked at the shop carefully, the way he looked at everything, and nodded twice. "It will do well," he said. "You sound certain," she said. "You are organized and you know what the town needs," he said. "Those 2 things together are rarer than people realize." She looked at him. He was looking at the newly painted sign above the door, not at her. "Thank you, Mr. Graves," she said. He nodded and left. She watched him walk away down the street and realized she had been looking forward to that visit in a way that had nothing to do with business. The trouble started in June. Harlan Dukes came into the shop one morning with the same gold watch chain and the same not quite meeting eyes, and he made her an offer to buy a 49% stake in Brooks Goods and Millinery. He framed it as an investment opportunity. He spoke at length about market access and supply chains and the advantages of having a partner with established relationships in the territory. When he finished, he sat back in the chair she kept near the counter for customers who needed to sit while they made selections, and he looked at her with the patient confidence of a man who expects to be accommodated. "I appreciate the interest," Theodora said. "I'm not currently seeking investors." "You might want to think on it," Harlan said. "This is a complicated county. Having the right connections matters." The emphasis on the word complicated was deliberate, and they both knew it. "I will certainly think on it," she said pleasantly, and waited until he left to let her hands curl into fists. She told Micah about it that afternoon. He had stopped by to discuss a forthcoming supply run she needed, and she found herself telling him more than she had planned to because his silence was the kind that invited honesty rather than performance. "He will come back," Micah said. He was leaning against the doorframe, not looking at her but toward the street. "I know," she said. "He has done this with 3 other businesses in the last 18 months, Micah said. "One sold, one left town, one burned." The word burned landed quietly in the air between them. "The one that burned," she said carefully, "was that ever investigated?" "Sheriff at the time ruled it accidental," Micah said. "The sheriff at the time is no longer the sheriff." She took a moment with that. "And the current sheriff, decent man," Micah said, "but stretched thin. The county is large and the company has interests in the north that keep him occupied." He finally looked at her then, and his eyes held something she had not seen in them before. It was not quite concern. It was something more guarded than concern, something that suggested he was weighing the cost of feeling it. "You should keep a record of every interaction with Dukes," he said. "Every visit, every word. In writing, dated, with a witness if you can manage it." "I already have," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said simply. She had begun keeping records of everything, a habit formed during the slow collapse of her first marriage when she had gradually understood that knowing the true state of things was the only power she had. She kept records of her sales, her expenses, her conversations with Dukes, her observations about the town's patterns and the movements of men she had learned to watch. She kept them in a locked box under the counter, and she showed them to no one, except Micah. One afternoon in early July, without entirely planning to, she unlocked the box and showed him the ledger where she had been noting Dukes's visits and comments. He read it carefully, standing at the counter, and she watched his face. "He is escalating," Micah said. "This note here from 3 weeks ago about the land office." He pointed to an entry. "He was trying to find out if your deed is clear." "It is clear," she said. "I know," he said. "I checked." She stared at him. "You checked my deed." He met her eyes then, and there was something in his expression that was almost uncomfortable, as though he had said more than he intended. "I checked the deeds on properties that interest me," he said carefully. She let that sit for a moment, that careful, layered sentence. "Mr. Graves," she said, "what exactly did you do before you came to Cimarron?" The uncomfortable thing in his expression became more pronounced. Drove freight, he said. Among other things. She waited. He looked at the ledger in his hands rather than at her. I worked for a land surveyor in Colorado for a time, he said. Before that I did investigative work for a mining company in Denver, looking into claims and title questions. It is a particular kind of work that leaves you with particular kinds of habits. She absorbed this. Such as checking deeds on properties that interest you. Among other things, he said again. She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful neutral set of his face and the slight tension around his jaw. Why did you leave Colorado? She asked. The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. There was a situation, he said finally, involving a man whose interests conflicted with the truth of what I had found. He was not pleased when I proved his title fraudulent. He had significant resources and he used them. He paused. I came to Cimarron because I needed somewhere quieter. I had hoped to stay out of situations like this one. And yet, she said, he looked up. And yet, he agreed, and the ghost of something that was genuinely a smile crossed his face for just a moment before it was gone. She felt that moment in her chest like a struck bell. After that, the nature of things between them shifted in a way that was not acknowledged but was impossible to ignore. He stopped by the shop more regularly than business strictly required. She found reasons to have small freight needs that required his particular attention. They talked about the shop, about the county's politics, about the legal complications of the Colfax land disputes. They talked about Clara Hensley's vegetable garden and the quality of the coffee at the hotel versus the boarding house, and the likelihood of the new postal route arriving on its promised schedule. They talked about everything except the thing that was quietly building between them like water rising behind a dam. Theodora was not naive about what she felt. She had been married. She had loved someone before. She understood her own heart well enough to recognize what was happening. But she was also freshly wounded and deeply practical, and she knew that Micah Graves was a man carrying hidden weight, a dark past he had only partially described, secrets that kept his face carefully closed and his voice carefully measured. She was also 26 years old and she was not dead. She noticed everything about him. She noticed the way he listened, fully and without interruption, which was rarer in a man than people admitted. She noticed the way he treated his horses, with the same careful economy of motion he applied to everything, no roughness, no waste. She noticed that the slight favoring of his left side came from an old scar that occasionally showed at his collar when his shirt shifted, a mark left by something that had happened in Colorado, and that he had not described beyond the vague reference to the conflict with the fraudulent mine owner. She noticed that he was 31 years old and had clearly decided something about himself that kept him at a careful distance from everyone around him. In July, the situation with Harlan Dukes worsened. His agent, a man named Chet Ridley, began making regular appearances on the street outside her shop, not entering, simply standing there in the way that was meant to be noticed. Theodora noted it in her ledger and continued opening on time every morning. She purchased a door with a better lock. She moved the locked box containing her records to the boarding house where she still maintained a room, reasoning that 2 locations were harder to compromise than one. She told Micah about Ridley. He knew Ridley already. He described him concisely as a man who handled Dukes' enforcement problems, meaning the problems that required intimidation rather than legal maneuvering. He said this without drama, and Theodora received it without drama, because they had both arrived in their 30s by learning to process difficult facts clearly. I want to escalate this to the sheriff, she said, before it escalates on its own. That is the right instinct, Micah said. He had come in that afternoon with a small crate of fabric samples she had ordered from a supplier in Denver, and he was unpacking it on the counter while they talked, handling the folded bolts of fabric with the same careful precision he applied to everything. I can come with you if that is useful. It is useful, she said, and they both knew she did not mean only in a practical sense. They went to the sheriff the following morning. The sheriff was a man named Warren Holt, 40 years old, square-jawed and plainly honest, who listened to Theodora's account of Dukes's offers and Ridley's presence without interruption, and read the relevant pages of her ledger with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. "You have kept good records, Mrs. Brooks," he said. "I have kept excellent records," she said, "and I intend to keep more." Sheriff Holt looked at Micah, who had said nothing during the meeting but had been present in the particular way that Micah was always present, absolutely still and absolutely attentive. "You prepared to testify to any of this, Graves?" Holt asked. "To what I have witnessed directly," Micah said. "Yes." The sheriff sent a deputy to speak with Ridley that afternoon. Ridley left the street outside her shop. He did not return for 2 weeks. When he did return, it was briefly, and then he stopped coming entirely, which she suspected meant that Dukes had received some communication from someone with authority, possibly the sheriff, possibly someone in Santa Fe, that made direct intimidation of her shop a more complicated proposition. She and Micah stood outside her shop on the evening. The sheriff sent word that Ridley had been formally cautioned. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the light was the particular amber gold of a New Mexico summer evening, extravagant and warm. Micah was looking at the street. She was looking at him. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me, for everything." He looked at her then, and whatever he was keeping carefully behind his measured expression cracked slightly, just at the edges. "You did not need me to come with you," he said. "You are more than capable." "That is not the same as not wanting you there," she said. The crack at the edges of his expression held for a moment visible before he reassembled it. "No," he said quietly, "I suppose it is not." She held his gaze. He held hers. The evening light poured over everything in that extravagant gold, and the moment stretched until it could not reasonably stretch any further. And then he glanced away toward the street and said something practical about the supply run to Albuquerque she needed next month, and they both pretended that the moment had not happened. But it had happened, and they both carried it. August arrived, and with it a dry heat that settled over the Cimarron Valley like a hand pressed flat against the earth. The shop was doing well, better than Theodora's most optimistic projections. She had expanded the fabric selection and brought in a consignment of ready-made hats that sold faster than she had anticipated. She hired a girl, 17-year-old Amelia Vasquez, granddaughter of the man who had sold her the building, to help with the counter on busy afternoons. She had also, gradually and somewhat against her better judgment, learned more about Micah Graves. She learned that he had grown up in Virginia, that his family had been moderately prosperous farmers until the war had taken what it took and left what it left, and that he had come west at 19 with little more than a strong back and a clear head. She learned that he had a particular facility for mathematics and spatial reasoning that had made him valuable first as a surveyor's assistant, and then as an investigative agent for the mining company in Denver. She learned that the conflict in Colorado had been not merely professional but deeply personal, that the man whose fraudulent title he had exposed had been someone he had once considered a friend, and that the exposure had cost Micah significantly more than his job. She learned all of this slowly in pieces, the way you learn the geography of new country, moving carefully and paying attention to what you find. Micah did not tell stories of himself. He answered direct questions honestly and concisely and volunteered nothing. But he answered her questions, which she suspected he did not do for many people. She also learned that he had never been married, that he had chosen, clearly and deliberately, to remain solitary, and that this choice was connected in some way she could not yet fully see to the events in Colorado and to something older that he had not yet described. One afternoon in mid-August, she asked him about his family. They were sitting in the shade outside the barn on upturned crates, both of them with cups of coffee that had gone lukewarm, having just finished reviewing the inventory list for her next Albuquerque order. The conversation had been entirely practical, and she could not have said exactly how they arrived at the question. "My mother died when I was 14, he said. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the ground. My father a few years later. I had a brother." He paused. "He died in '71, mining accident in Nevada." "I am sorry," she said. "He was the better of the two of us," Micah said quietly. It was not self-pity. It was stated as a straightforward fact, the way he stated all facts. He was the kind of person who made wherever he was better. I am more the kind of person who keeps things from getting worse. She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a significant underestimation of yourself," she said. He glanced at her with something that was almost surprise. "You do not merely keep things from getting worse," she said. "You are precise and honest, and you have helped me more than you had any obligation to, and you treat everyone in this town with more fundamental respect than most people manage." She paused. "You are the kind of person who makes things work. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot." The silence after she said this was different from Micah's usual silences. It was not measured. It was uncertain. "Theodora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He stopped as if he had not entirely planned to use it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes that she could not quite read, something that moved behind the careful stillness of his face like water under ice. "Nothing," he said finally. He looked back at the ground. "Thank you for what you said." She nodded, and they finished their cold coffee in silence, but the air between them had changed in a way that was permanent, and they both felt it. In September, Harlan Dukes made a final move. It did not come as direct intimidation this time. It came through a letter, delivered formally through the land office, informing Theodora that the building she occupied had a secondary lien filed against it by the Maxwell Land Grant Company dating to 1874, predating Mr. Vasquez's ownership. The letter informed her that unless this lien was resolved, the company had a claim against the property that superseded her deed. She read the letter 3 times, very calmly, set it on the counter, and then went to find Micah. He read it in her shop, standing at the counter in the fading afternoon light. She watched his face. It went through several careful calculations. "This is Dukes working through the company," he said. "The lien may be genuine or it may be manufactured. I need to look at the original land records." "Can you do that?" she asked. "I spent 4 years doing exactly that in Colorado," he said. "Yes." He spent the following 3 days at the land office in Cimarron, and then rode to the county seat to review additional records, coming back dusty and tired both times, but with a growing collection of notes in his careful handwriting. On the 4th day he came into her shop shortly after opening with a folder of papers and the expression of a man who has found something he expected to find. "The lien is fraudulent," he said. "It was filed in 1874, but the document shows clear signs of alteration. The original filing date was 1876, 2 years after Mr. Vasquez purchased the property, which means it was filed against someone who no longer owned it. The company's title agent altered the date to make it appear prior to the sale." He set the papers on the counter. "I have documented the discrepancy in the handwriting of the date numerals compared to the rest of the document, and I have found 2 additional instances of the same agent filing similarly altered liens against properties in the county." Theodora looked at the papers. She looked at Micah. "You did this in 3 days," she said. 4, he said. "I am slower than I used to be." "This is extraordinary," she said. "It is thorough," he corrected. "There is a difference." They took everything to Sheriff Holt, who took it to the territorial attorney's office in Santa Fe. The process that followed took 6 weeks, 6 weeks during which Theodora continued opening her shop every morning and Micah continued running his freight operation, and the town watched with the interested attention of a community that has learned to wait for outcomes rather than assume them. At the end of 6 weeks, the Maxwell Land Grant Company's agent in the county was formally charged with fraud. 2 weeks after that, Harlan Dukes left Cimarron for Colorado with considerably less dignity than he had possessed when Theodora had arrived. The day she heard he had gone, she stood in her shop and let out a breath she felt as though she had been holding since March. Clara Hensley came by that afternoon to celebrate with 2 pieces of apple cake she had baked, and Theodora ate hers at the counter and felt, for the second time since arriving in Cimarron, something that was genuinely close to happiness. She wanted to share it with Micah. She told herself this was a natural impulse born of gratitude and the shared effort of the preceding months. But she sat with it honestly in the quiet of her shop that evening and admitted to herself that it was not only gratitude. It had not been only gratitude for some time. She found him at the barn, working by lamplight on a section of wagon harness that needed repair. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his face changed slightly, the same barely perceptible shift she had noticed before. "He is gone," she said. "I heard," Micah said. "I wanted to tell you myself," she said. "And to say thank you, properly, not just for the land records but for all of it from the beginning." He set down the harness. He was very still in the lamplight, which made the light and shadow on his face do interesting things that she was trying not to notice too acutely. "You would have managed without me," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "Eventually. But you made the difference between barely surviving and actually winning. That matters." He looked at her for a long time. The barn was quiet around them, just the soft sounds of the horses in their stalls and the distant noise of the town settling into its evening patterns. "I want to ask you something," she said. She had not planned to say it quite yet, but the moment had its own logic. He waited. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively but as a way of holding herself still against the thing that was trying to move through her. "Are you going to stay in Cimarron?" she asked. "Now that this is resolved." It was not the question she had actually wanted to ask. It was the question adjacent to it, the one that was safe enough to ask out loud. Micah seemed to understand this. His expression did something complicated, and for a moment she thought he was going to say what she was actually waiting for him to say. But he looked away toward the horses. "I have not decided," he said. She nodded, pressed her lips together, and told him good night, and walked back to the boarding house in the October dark with her hands in fists at her sides. October moved toward November, and the town settled into its autumn rhythms. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the Cimarron River went gold and then brown and fell, and the evenings came earlier and cooled quickly, and Theodora put a small iron stove in the shop that smelled pleasantly of wood smoke when it was lit. She and Micah saw each other less frequently now that the crisis with Dukes was resolved, and there was no immediate practical reason for daily contact. She noticed his absence in her days with a physical specificity that annoyed her. She was not a woman who defined herself by another person's presence. She had proven that sufficiently over the past year. But she missed him, in the particular way you miss someone who has become essential to the way you think rather than merely to your comfort. He came by the shop twice in October, once to deliver a small order she had placed with a Denver supplier, and once on no stated business at all, staying for perhaps 20 minutes, drinking coffee and talking about the shop's performance and the news coming down from the northern part of the county about further land disputes. He was exactly as he always was, careful and precise and fully present, and she watched him with the patient attention she had been applying to him since March and understood that whatever he was holding back was large. She also understood, now, enough of his history to guess at its shape. The man in Colorado who had been his friend, whose fraudulent title Micah had exposed, had been more than a professional associate. He had been, she suspected from small things Micah had let slip over months, someone Micah had trusted in a way he had trusted almost no one before or since. The exposure, the conflict, the need to leave, had not merely cost him a job and a location. It had cost him his faith in his own judgment about people, had taught him in the most painful way possible that the people you let inside the walls of your careful reserve are precisely the people who can do you the most damage. He was afraid, not of her, she thought, of himself, of what it would cost him if he let himself be wrong again. She understood this in her bones. She had married a charming man with creative accounting and buried both him and her own financial security in the same week. She knew something about the particular paralysis of having been wrong about someone you loved. The difference was that she had decided, somewhere in the process of crossing 4 states and rebuilding herself from nothing in a strange town with almost no resources, that she was not going to let the past make all her future decisions for her. She had chosen, consciously and with full knowledge of the risk, to live forward. She wanted Micah Graves to make the same choice. In early November, a small party of local men organized a camp trip into the foothills east of Cimarron, a hunting and fishing expedition that had become an annual tradition among a loose group of townspeople, who used it as an excuse to spend 2 days outside town before winter properly set in. Clara Hensley's husband organized it, and Clara invited Theodora, explaining that several of the wives came along and the whole thing was more social than sporting. Micah was mentioned as one of the regular participants, which Theodora filed away without comment. She went. She packed sensibly, brought the Remington rifle because she always brought it, and rode out with the party on a Friday morning with 15 other people. Horses packed with food and bedrolls, and the general cheerful chaos of a group that does this every year and has established rituals around it. They made camp in a meadow in the foothills with a good creek and a natural windbreak of ponderosa pines, and the evening settled in clear and cold and brilliant with stars. 3 large fires were built, coffee was made, and the kind of comfortable outdoor sociability unfolded that only happens when people who know each other well are taken out of their usual contexts. Micah arrived separately, coming in from a different direction with 2 other men and a string of pack horses. He unsaddled with the efficient speed of a man who has done it thousands of times, and appeared at the fire with a cup of coffee and his characteristic stillness, fitting himself into the group without effort because he was fundamentally untroublesome company. He found himself across the fire from Theodora, and they talked at first in the easy way of the group, talking with everyone and incidentally with each other. And then, as the evening wore on and people drifted to other fires or to their bedrolls, they found themselves in the comfortable position of 2 people left by natural attrition in the same spot. The fire had burned down to coals. The night was very cold and very clear. Theodora had her coat and her blanket and her stubbornness, and Micah had his coat and the peculiar contained warmth of a man who runs slightly hotter than average. She had noticed this in summer when everyone else complained of the heat, and he merely seemed comfortable. They talked quietly. About the shop, about his winter plans, about a book she had been reading that she had described briefly once before, and that he had apparently remembered and thought about, because he asked her now what she had concluded about the central argument. She told him, and he disagreed with her in the careful, respectful way he had of disagreeing with her, acknowledging the strength of her position before laying out the complications he saw. She loved this about him. She registered that thought and let it be what it was. The conversation drifted, as conversations do at 3 hours past midnight with stars overhead and a fire burning low. He told her about the first time he had seen mountains, coming west at 19 from the flat farmland of Virginia, standing in a field in eastern Colorado, and watching the Rockies rise out of the horizon, and feeling that the world was considerably larger than he had understood. He said it without sentimentality, just as a moment of accurate information about himself, but she heard what was underneath it. The boy from the farm who had needed the world to be larger than it had shown him so far. She told him about her mother's hairbrush, the silver one she carried everywhere, and about her mother, who had died when Theodora was 20, and who had been the most practical and also the most courageous person she had ever known. She said that she measured most of her major decisions against what she thought her mother would have thought, and that her mother had believed the worst thing you could do was let fear make your choices for you. Micah was quiet for a moment after she said this. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She was," Theodora said. She looked at the coals. "I try to be." "You are," he said very quietly. She looked up. He was not looking at her, but his voice had changed, shifted slightly into a register she had not heard from him before, something that was not guarded. This was the moment. She knew it the way you know certain things, with the full-body certainty that cannot be argued with. The fire was low and the night was enormous around them, and they were entirely alone at this end of the camp, and Micah Graves was finally, fractionally, less defended than usual. She looked at him steadily. The question organized itself inside her with a clarity that surprised her, even though she had been carrying it for months. "Micah," she said. He looked at her. "Do you love me?" she asked. The question was direct and clean, and she did not dress it up or apologize for it, and she held his gaze without flinching. The silence was very long. She watched his face move through something she could not entirely read, something with many layers, surprise and recognition and fear, and something larger than fear underneath it all. "Ask me again when you are ready," he said quietly. She stared at him. He held her gaze for one more beat and then rose, unhurried, set his cup down by the fire, put his hat on, and walked away into the darkness of the camp toward the picket line where the horses were tied. She sat by the coals with her blanket around her shoulders and her heart beating in a strange, complicated rhythm. Ready. He had said when she was ready. Not when he was ready, though she suspected that was part of what he meant. But the particular way he had said it, the slight emphasis, the way his eyes had held hers for that final moment before he turned, said something that was not a refusal. It was a question returned. It was a door left unlocked but not yet opened. She sat with it for perhaps an hour. The camp was quiet around her. The fire died to a deep red glow. The stars were enormous and brilliant in the November sky. Ready. She turned the word over, looking at it from every angle. She had asked him if he loved her, and he had not said no. He had not been cold or dismissive. He had been careful. He had been, she realized, honest in his way. He was telling her something about himself. He was telling her that he needed to know she meant it fully, that she was not asking from a moment of fireside feeling, but from a considered and genuine place. Or perhaps he was asking something about himself. Perhaps when he said ready, he meant ready in the way she had been thinking about him, ready to choose forward instead of backward, ready to trust his own judgment about a person again after what had happened in Colorado. She looked into the dark where he had walked. She was ready. She had been ready since approximately August, if she was being honest. She was ready and she was decided, and she was not going to let fear make this decision for her because her mother had taught her better than that. She rose, folded her blanket over her arm, and walked toward the horses. She found him at the picket line, checking the horses the way he always checked things, carefully and thoroughly. He heard her coming and turned, and in the darkness with the starlight falling pale and cold over everything, he looked very still and very watchful. She stopped 3 feet from him. She held his gaze. "I am ready," she said. The stillness in his face shifted. Something large moved behind his eyes. "Theodora," he began. "I have been in love with you since sometime in August," she said. "I have been watching you since March, and I know what I see. I am not asking from a feeling of tonight. I am asking from 4 months of paying close attention, which is how I do everything that matters." She paused. "I am asking you again. Do you love me?" The silence was different from the previous one. It was not the silence of a man weighing whether to speak. It was the silence of a man who has already made his decision and is only managing the moment of saying it out loud. "Yes," Micah Graves said. "I have loved you since sometime around July, if we are being specific, possibly earlier." She let out a breath that she had not known she was holding. "Then why?" she started. "Because I needed to know you would ask twice," he said. "Because I needed to know it was not the fire and the night and the feeling of a moment. Because I know what it costs me when I am wrong about a person, and I could not bear to be wrong about you." He looked at her, and the careful reserve was gone now, genuinely gone, and what was underneath it was large and certain and entirely unguarded. "I am not wrong about you." She closed the 3 feet between them. He was taller than her by a significant measure, and when she stepped close to him, he looked down at her with that same unguarded expression. And then he took her face in his careful, precise hands and kissed her. And it was exactly the kind of kiss that a man gives when he has been thinking about it for months, certain and thorough, and with a great deal of feeling behind it. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the horses were warm and present around them, and the night was cold and brilliant and absolutely perfect. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally separated, she kept her hands against his coat, and he kept his hands framing her face, and they looked at each other in the dark. "I was not going to ask twice," she admitted. "I had decided I would before morning, but it was not without significant effort." Something that was completely and unambiguously a smile crossed his face, the first full smile she had ever seen from him, and it rearranged his features entirely, made him suddenly and vividly handsome in a way she had been carefully not noticing for months. "I know," he said. "I counted on you being stubborn." She laughed, a real laugh startled out of her. "You manipulated me with my own stubbornness." "I gave you the opportunity to choose clearly," he corrected, and his eyes were still smiling, "which is different from manipulation." "That is an extremely fine distinction," she said. "I am a precise man," he said, and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with a carefulness that was almost unbearable in its gentleness. They walked back to the fire together, and she sat close enough to him that their shoulders touched and neither of them moved away. And they talked until the sky began to lighten in the east, easy and deep, and without guarding anything, and it was the best conversation of Theodora's life. The months that followed were the happiest and simultaneously most frightening of both their lives. Happy because the thing between them was as real and as solid as they had both privately suspected it would be. Frightening because both of them were people who had learned to be afraid of happiness, and had to consciously choose, each day, not to let that learned fear do their thinking for them. Micah was careful and thoughtful and surprisingly, quietly tender in a way that his outward reserve had not predicted. Or perhaps it had predicted exactly this, since care and precision applied to a person you love produces a particular and irreplaceable kind of attention. He noticed things she had not told him she cared about. He remembered things she said in passing. He sat with her in the evenings when the shop closed and they would talk for hours, or sometimes sit in a companionable silence that felt more intimate than talking. He told her about Colorado. All of it, not in pieces as before but the full account, which took a long evening and a significant quantity of the good coffee she ordered from Denver. The friend's name had been James Arbor. They had worked together for 2 years at the mining company in Denver, and Micah had trusted him completely and had considered him the finest person he knew. When he found the evidence of James's involvement in the title fraud, he had gone to James directly first, privately, giving him the chance to come clean. James had tried to pay him to disappear the evidence. When Micah refused, James had arranged for him to be dismissed from the company, had spread stories about his competence and his character in Denver that made it impossible for him to work in the field again, and had used connections with certain political figures to ensure that a formal complaint Micah filed went nowhere. And the injury, she learned, the slight favoring of his left side that she had noticed on their very first meeting, was from a night in Denver when 2 men had followed him from the land records office and beaten him with methodical efficiency behind a building on Market Street. He had never been able to prove James was behind it. He was fairly certain he had been. "And then?" she asked. She kept her voice steady because she could hear how much effort the telling was costing him. "And then I came south," he said. "I needed somewhere where no one knew my name. I needed to decide whether I was the kind of person who keeps going after something like that or the kind who doesn't." "And," she said. He looked at her across the small table in the back room of her shop where they had taken to having their evenings. "I kept going," he said, slowly. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he looked at her hand holding his with an expression of such naked gratitude that she had to look away for a moment to give them both room. "He was wrong about you," she said. "I know that now," he said. She looked back at him. You knew it before, she said. That is why you refused to disappear the evidence. You knew what was right, and you did it even though it cost you everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Knowing something and believing it about yourself are different things, he said. Yes, she said. They are. She held his hand and he held hers, and the stove burned steadily in the corner and the night was quiet outside. They announced nothing formally because there was nothing yet to announce, but Cimarron was a small town and small towns are observant, and by December the general understanding that Micah Graves and Theodora Brooks were something to each other was fairly well established. Clara Hensley was pleased in the warm, unsentimental way of a woman who has been watching two sensible people be foolish for months, and is relieved they have finally stopped. Sheriff Holt gave Micah a look the next time he saw him that conveyed several sentences worth of approval in a single expression. December brought the first serious snow, and Micah began, by small increments, spending more time at the shop and less at the barn during the coldest evenings. He was scrupulous about propriety in a way that she found both endearing and slightly exasperating, because small towns were observant, and he was aware of her reputation and her business in a way that proved again that he thought about her interests as seriously as his own. One evening in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, with snow coming down steadily outside and the shop warm with the stove and lamplight, he asked her to marry him. He did it without preamble or theatrical staging, just looked at her across the accounts she was reviewing and said it, directly and simply, the way he did everything that mattered. "Theodora," he said, "will you marry me?" She put down her pen and looked at him. His face was open in the way it had become open since that night by the fire in November, the careful reserve still present but no longer hiding anything important. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." The smile came, the full one that rearranged his face and that she was now quite in love with. "Obviously," he repeated. "I asked you twice by a horse picket in the dark," she said. "I think my position has been clear." He laughed. It was a real laugh, less rare now than it had been in October, and it was the best sound she had heard since she was a girl. They were married in February of 1879 in the small church in Cimarron, with Clara Hensley and her husband as witnesses and Sheriff Holt and his wife in attendance, and Amelia Vasquez there in the best dress she owned, looking enormously pleased with herself, as though she had personally arranged the whole thing. Theodora wore a dark green dress she had made herself from the best wool she stocked in the shop, and Micah wore a clean suit that fit him well and had clearly been recently acquired, which she found touching beyond reason. He looked at her when she walked down the aisle of the small church with Clara's husband on her arm, and the look on his face was the kind that a woman keeps for the rest of her life as a reference point, the thing against which she measures whether she made the right choice. She had absolutely made the right choice. They said their vows in the direct, plain words of the ceremony, and both of them meant every word fully, which is rarer than the ceremony usually acknowledges. They moved into a house together in March, a proper house with 4 rooms and a yard that would support a kitchen garden and a small barn that could hold Micah's 2 horses and the wagon. It was on the east edge of town, close enough to the shop to walk and close enough to the hills that you could hear coyotes at night and see the mountains clearly from the back step on any morning without clouds. Theodora loved it immediately and fiercely in the way she loved things, practically and completely. The business continued to grow. Micah expanded his freight operation over the spring, taking on a contract with a new mining interest north of Cimarron that needed regular supply runs to Elizabethtown. He hired a young man named Samuel Reyes, 19 years old and keen to learn the freight business, and spent considerable time teaching him the careful methodology he applied to everything. Theodora watched this from a respectful distance and felt something add itself to her already substantial feeling for her husband, the way he taught, which was the same as the way he did everything, patient and precise, and without condescension. The Colfax County situation continued to simmer in the background, as it would for years. The Maxwell Land Grant Company's influence waned gradually as federal attention increased, and the legal challenges against their claims accumulated. Several of the smaller landowners and settlers who had been most at risk were able to secure their properties with less legal danger by late 1879 and into 1880, and Micah contributed to several of these cases by using his title research skills to document the discrepancies in the company's claims. He did this quietly, without seeking recognition, because it was the right thing to do and because he could not, as he put it to Theodora one evening, look the other way at injustice when he had the specific tools to do something about it. She had kissed him for that thoroughly because she agreed completely, and because kissing him was still, a year into marriage, the most satisfying thing she could think of to do in any given moment. In the fall of 1879, Theodora discovered she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Micah, not from uncertainty but from the private desire to have it to herself for a little while, this large and tender thing. When she told him, she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions she had never seen before. Careful Micah Graves, who had expressions for everything, suddenly surprised into pure, unmediated feeling. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said. Clara confirmed it. He crossed the room and pulled her to him and held on, and she could feel in the way he held her the enormous weight of everything he had decided when he chose to go forward instead of backward, all of it arriving at once in this particular moment. "Are you frightened?" she asked against his shoulder. "Considerably," he said. "Yes, you." "Considerably," she confirmed. "Yes." They stood like that for a long time, and the lamplight was warm around them, and outside the window the first stars of the evening were coming out over the mountains. The pregnancy progressed well into the winter. Theodora continued working in the shop until February, when she reluctantly conceded that sitting behind the counter for 8 hours was no longer comfortable, and passed the daily management to Amelia, who had grown into a competent and trustworthy young woman of 18 who cared genuinely about the shop's success. Theodora continued doing the books from home and directing strategy and orders, which she could do at the kitchen table just as effectively as at the counter. Micah was attentive in the way he was attentive to everything, deeply and practically. He never fussed. He did not treat her as though pregnancy had made her fragile, because she had made it clear early on that she found this insulting, and he had immediately and completely adjusted. But he was there, thoroughly there, in every way that mattered. Their son was born in May of 1880. The birth was attended by a capable midwife named Mrs. Aragon and by Clara Hensley, and it was not an easy birth, but it was a successful one. And the boy arrived in the world in the early hours of a warm May morning with his father's dark hair and his mother's absolute determination, which was evident, Micah said afterward, from the first moment. They named him Henry, after Theodora's father, with James as a middle name, after Micah's brother. Micah had proposed this carefully, the Henry from her side, and she had added the James because she had understood by then that the best thing she could do with the story of his brother was to carry some of it forward. Henry Graves was, by any objective measure, a remarkable infant and then a remarkable toddler, which is what all parents believe about their children, and which in Henry's case happened to have significant basis in fact. He was serene and focused in the way of children who have been born into households where things are done carefully and well. He watched everything with wide, dark eyes and learned things quickly, and sat with enormous patience while his father showed him how mechanical things worked, which was apparently a fascination they shared. By 1881, the shop had expanded into the building next door, which Theodora purchased from a retired carpenter who was moving to Santa Fe to live with relatives. She expanded the dry goods inventory and added a small section of books and periodicals, which she had wanted to do since the first month in Cimarron, and which now produced a steady and satisfying income from the town's considerable appetite for reading material. She also began, quietly and without making an announcement about it, extending informal credit to several families in town who were going through difficult periods, the same sort of difficult periods she had gone through in Abilene, the kind where you have skills and willingness but not quite enough cash to bridge a gap. She kept records of it all naturally. It was a habit she could not and did not want to break. Micah knew about the credit arrangements because he knew about everything that happened in the shop, and he said nothing about it except once. When she showed him the ledger page, he ran his finger down the column and then looked at her and said, "You are your mother," in a tone that contained more feeling than most people put into much longer sentences. She had had to look at the floor for a moment after he said that. The freight business had become genuinely substantial by this time. Micah had taken on 2 more employees in addition to Samuel Ray's, and the contract with the Elizabethtown mining interest had been renewed twice and expanded. He had a reputation in the county now for absolute reliability and scrupulous honesty, and business came to him for exactly those reasons. He worked hard and planned carefully and knew to the penny where every dollar was at any given time, which Theodora found extremely attractive. They had built something. Together, from very little in a complicated county in a complicated territory, they had built something real and solid and good. In the spring of 1882, Theodora found herself expecting again. This discovery she shared with Micah immediately rather than keeping it to herself, because the private pleasure of the first time had taught her that sharing it with him was better. He held her face in his hands when she told him, the same gesture he had made the night of the first kiss, and looked at her with everything fully visible in his eyes. "Good," he said. "Henry needs someone to practice patience with." She laughed. "You think a sibling will teach patience?" "I think everything is educational if you pay attention," he said, and kissed her forehead and went to make coffee because he was a practical man. The second child was a girl, born in December of 1882, healthy and loud, and immediately in possession of opinions about everything in her vicinity. They named her Clara, after the woman who had been Theodora's first friend in Cimarron, and little Clara Hensley was enormously and visibly pleased by this honor in a way that made Theodora's chest ache with affection. Henry, now 2 years old, received his sister with the careful assessment of a child who has been raised by 2 people who assess things carefully, and then decided she was acceptable, which everyone agreed was high praise from a 2-year-old. The house on the east edge of town became the kind of house that is full and warm, where the smells of good food and lamp oil and sawdust and occasionally horse move through the rooms together, where there are always books on every surface and someone's hat left on the wrong peg, and coffee kept warm on the stove from morning until late in the evening. Clara Hensley came for dinner twice a month, and Sheriff Holt and his wife came quarterly, and Samuel Ray's had become close enough to the family to be an unofficial fixture, eating Sunday meals with them whenever he was in town. In 1883, the town of Cimarron incorporated properly and began the formal process of establishing civic institutions that the land dispute had made impossible for years. A school was organized. A proper courthouse was planned. A volunteer fire company was established. Micah joined the fire company because it was practical and useful, and he served on the committee that organized the school because he had strong opinions about the importance of education. Theodora served on the school committee as well, and was entirely responsible for the fact that the school's first significant book acquisition included not merely the required reading primers, but also a substantial collection of history, natural science, and literature. The schoolteacher they hired, a young woman named Miss Frances Daly, who had come from Ohio with excellent credentials and a delightful willingness to be outdoors, stayed in Cimarron longer than teachers usually did because the community supported her work in ways she had not expected. And because she met Micah's employee Samuel Ray's at a town social in October, and the resulting courtship was so similar to a particular other courtship in Cimarron's recent history that both Theodora and Micah had to work very hard not to comment on it. They both commented on it, just to each other quietly in the evenings when the children were asleep, and the house was theirs again in the particular way of houses after children's bedtimes. He spent 20 minutes explaining the weight distribution of a freight wagon to her, Micah said, with the expression of a man examining a slightly absurd piece of evidence. She asked him follow-up questions, Theodora said. She is clearly intelligent, he said. He is clearly lost, she said. They looked at each other across the table, and the lamplight was the same it had always been, and the years were visible in each other's faces in ways that were entirely beautiful if you were the right people looking. I never explained freight wagon weight distribution to you, Micah said. I think you explained deed filing discrepancy, she said. That is more or less the same thing. He reached across the table and took her hand. His hands were the same, careful and precise, and the particular warmth of them was one of the best things in the world as far as she was concerned. Theodora, he said. His voice had that quality it got sometimes, the one that had nothing to do with practical matters. Yes, she said. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. Old habits of careful attention applied. When I left Colorado, he said slowly, as if choosing the words with even more than usual care, I had decided that I was done. Not with work, not with living, but with the particular kind of risk that comes from letting yourself belong to something. I thought I had made the accounting of it honestly and the cost was too high. He paused. And then I looked up from a wagon wheel, and a woman was standing in my barn asking about trunks, and she was looking at me in a way that I knew immediately I was going to have to manage very carefully, or I was going to lose track of all my previous decisions. She was very still. The lamp burned between them. It took me until November to stop managing it, he said, and everything since then has been. He paused again. I do not have the right words for what everything since then has been. Try, she said quietly. He looked at her. Everything since then has been the reason I kept going when going was difficult, he said. You are why I stayed in Cimarron and why I will stay. You and Henry and Clara and whatever comes next and this house and everything we have built here. He stopped. I want to say it in terms of specific components, because you are the kind of person who appreciates specific components. She pressed her lips together because she was very close to crying and she was not a woman who cried easily. You are correct that I appreciate specific components, she managed. The specific components, he said, add up to you being the best thing that has ever happened to me, by a very significant margin. She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat in his lap, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the children were in bed and they were private again, and she put her arms around his neck, and he put his arms around her, and they stayed like that for a long time with the lamplight warm and the house quiet around them. The accounting, she said against his collar. Does it balance now? She felt the slight movement of his laugh more than heard it. It balances extraordinarily well, he said. She lifted her head and kissed him, slow and thorough, and he kissed her back with the same care he applied to everything that mattered. And outside the mountain stood enormous and permanent under the New Mexico stars. The years passed the way years do when they are good, not slowly, not without difficulty, but with a texture of meaning that makes the difficult parts bearable and the beautiful parts luminous. The shop grew steady and well managed under Theodora's hand, and eventually under Henry's interest as well, because Henry at 9 years old had his father's facility for numbers and his mother's fierce interest in making things work. Clara was different from her brother in almost every way, louder and more physically bold, interested in horses and the outdoor mechanics of the freight operation, which she followed Micah through with focused devotion. A third child came in 1886, another boy they named Thomas James, a name carefully chosen to carry both weight and healing in it. Thomas arrived with his mother's sharp brown eyes and a temperament that was immediately and obviously his own thing, sunny and sociable and interested in everything equally, the counterweight to Henry's precision and Clara's intensity. Samuel Reyes married Frances Daly in the spring of 1884, in the same small church where Micah and Theodora had been married, and Theodora wore the green dress again, let out slightly and rehemmed, because it was a good dress, and because she was sentimental about it in ways she did not fully explain to anyone. The county settled by degrees into something more like peace. The Maxwell Land Grant Company's power waned through the mid-1880s as court cases accumulated and federal scrutiny increased. And while the resolution of the land disputes was never perfectly clean, the worst of the pressure on small landowners eased. The school flourished. The town's civic institutions took hold and produced the kind of ordinary, functional community life that is the best evidence that a place intends to last. Micah's freight business continued to expand, and then, in 1887, contracted somewhat when the railroad arrived closer to Cimarron, and changed the economics of the freight industry in ways he had anticipated and planned for. He adapted the business toward shorter, more local routes and specialized contracts, which was less expansive but more stable. He was not troubled by the change because he was a man who had long since made peace with the difference between what he wanted and what was, and because his wife was the kind of financial mind who had seen the railroad coming and built the shop's reserves accordingly. In the evenings they still sat together at the kitchen table after the children's bedtimes, with coffee and lamplight, and whatever project was currently demanding attention. Theodora did the accounts and Micah reviewed his contracts, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet in the mutual silence of two people who have been married long enough to understand that presence is its own form of conversation. She still caught him watching her sometimes, with the same expression he had worn across the fire in November of 1878, something open and unguarded and certain. She still felt the struck bell feeling in her chest when she saw it. One evening in 1889, with Henry 9 and Clara 7 and Thomas 3, and all of them miraculously asleep at the same time, Micah looked up from his papers and said, "Do you remember asking me twice?" She looked at him over her ledger. "I remember everything about that night," she said. "I was watching you for an hour before you came to find me," he said. "At the picket line, I heard you come across the camp." She lowered the ledger. "You heard me coming and you still, I needed to know if you would actually say it again," he said. "I needed to see you choose it." She shook her head slowly. "Micah Graves," she said, "you are extraordinarily manipulative for someone who is technically very honest." The smile came, full and easy, much more available now than it had been in 1878, one of the best things that years had done. "I gave you the opportunity to choose clearly," he said, exactly as he had said it that night, word for word, "which is different from manipulation." "It is not different," she said. "It is a very fine distinction," he said serenely. She threw her pen cloth at him, which she had never done before, and he caught it without looking up from his papers because he always knew exactly where she was and what she was doing, and she laughed. A real laugh that she had to muffle with her hand against the sleeping children. He looked at her then, with the lamplight gold between them and the years in both their faces, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her when his guard was fully down, with everything visible and nothing hidden. "I would ask me again tonight," he said quietly, "if you were still willing to ask." She held his gaze for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the house was quiet, and the mountains stood outside the window in the early autumn night, enormous and permanent and full of stars. "Do you love me?" she asked. "With everything I have," he said. "Yes." She got up and came around the table and he stood to meet her, and when she put her hands against his chest and he put his hands against her face, it was the same gesture, the same hands, the same person who had kissed her for the first time by a horse picket in the November dark. And it was also more than that. It was all the years of precision and honesty, and the children sleeping in the back rooms, and the accounts balanced in the ledger on the table, and the house on the east edge of town, with the mountains at the back door. She kissed him and he kissed her, and outside the stars were the same stars they had always been over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the fire in the kitchen stove burned warm and steady. And in the rooms beyond, 3 children breathed the deep, easy breath of children who have never had reason to be afraid of home. They stood together in the lamplight for a long time after, her head against his shoulder and his arms around her, listening to the quiet of the house they had made, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. The years ahead held what years ahead always hold: good things and hard things and ordinary beautiful things, more children perhaps, and the children growing, and the work of a life lived honestly in a place that had been chosen and earned. But in this moment, standing in the warm kitchen with everything they had built around them, Theodora Brooks and Micah Graves were entirely complete. She had asked him twice, and both times the answer had been everything.